In this lesson, we're going to learn how to move around our game objects and edit our components in Unity. Now I've just opened up 07_begin in the lessons folder, and this is just where we left off, where we have a few assets we can play with, or a few game objects we can play with. Now you've already seen me move things around, but let's just take a few minutes to talk about the various transformation tools and the various editing tools we have here in the inspector. So to begin moving something, obviously we need to select it first. Now, if you have the hand icon selected, that is disabling your selection. So select one of the move tools, either the move, rotate, or scale. Now to access these quickly, we have the shortcut keys W for move, E for rotate, and R for scale. So if we hit W, we can left click and drag on any of these axes to move them in that axis. So obviously if we need to move something up, we'll left click and drag this Y arrow. Now we can also actually move from the center point. However, this is a little bit difficult to use because we're actually transforming all three axes at the same time. So if you take a look over here on the right, this game object, or every game object, has a transform component. And the position is just telling us where it lives in 3D space. Now if we left click and drag, who knows where we're actually doing or what kind of a transformation we're making. You can see here we can put it below the floor or all the way through the ceiling. We have to be careful whenever holding down or positioning using this center axis. I usually use it sort of as the first move, and then I rotate my view a little bit and then use these axes to get the exact positioning correct. And then of course the F key will frame in nicely so we can get exact placement. Now after position we have rotation, so if we hit the E key or jump up here and click this icon, we can now rotate our object in any of the three axes, or we can left click and drag in the center to rotate, just you guessed it, on all three axes at once. And with rotation, I really don't have that much of a problem with grabbing it and just starting to rotate it. As you can see here, it's not easy to control, but we're not going to get as random results as with left clicking and dragging in the middle with a position. This usually allows me to get 99% of the way there, and then I can just tweak a few axes to get it exactly where I want. Now after rotation we also have scaling, which allows us to control the size of this object. Again, that's the R key or this icon here, and again we can modify this either through individual axes, which often distorts our model, or we can left click and drag in the center to scale up our entire model in the same way. Now if you ever need to reset your scale, just come over here to your inspector and just type in 1s in both or all three X, Y, and Z, and that will reset it back to the normal scale. Now it is possible, I believe, to have a scale of 0, but that is problem causing because it essentially disappears. So it happens very rarely, but if your object suddenly disappears, check if your scale is 0 because it's possible that it somehow accidentally got set to that. And again, all three axes are available to us. So those are the three transformation tools, but we actually have a few different ways we can use them. And we can control them with these two buttons here, which are right next to them. By default, I'm going to be on center and local, but this is of course whether we've clicked these buttons or changed our interface. We can just left click to change from center to the pivot point. Now I've positioned the pivot point of this cup to be on the base so that I can modify it easier. And of course, the pivot point is usually set inside your 3D application. So depending on how you modeled this or how you created it, you may or may not want to modify it based off of its pivot point. And that is where we can change from the pivot point to the center point of our object. And again, I find use for both, so I'm often switching between these two. Next we have local and global space. To see this, let's just rotate one of our objects and hit the W key. Now you can see here, if I'm on local space, my transformation handles are going to be aligned with the original transformation or the original direction of our object. If we reset, our rotation to 0, our local and our global will align perfectly. However, if we have any kind of rotation, we're going to begin seeing a difference between local and global. Both of these have very many uses. For example, if you know you need to move it downwards, if we're in a local, none of these are down. So you might be tempted to grab this and try to move this down, but remember, we're going to be moving in all three axes, so it's very unreliable to move this way. We usually want to change over to global, and then we can move only in the y-axis and be confident that we're not changing the z or the x-axis. Now these two settings are also useful for the rotation. As you can see here, we can switch between a global rotation, which is very useful for, again, the y-axis as well as the x and z, and again to local to rotate along this specific axis. Now for scaling, we're not going to be able to change to a local scaling. Or in other words, you can see that the local is now unselectable. We cannot change it. And what we're seeing here is the local of the scale. So we can only scale locally. And this is somewhat of an important distinction because you can see it's grayed out here. And if we change it over to global and hit R to switch back to our scale, it's the exact same scale tool. So even if this says global, we're only going to be scaling locally. So now let's take a look a little bit deeper into the inspector. And to do this, let's select a light because they're interesting to look at and they change our game environment. So I'm just going to hit F to frame in on this light here. And let's just take a look at how we can change the attributes of our components. So we know we can use the transformation tools, and we've seen that before. You've also seen us left click and drag on these things to change something like the color or change the intensity. But we can also actually change other attributes by left-clicking and dragging on their name. So you can see here we have access to control the range by left-clicking and dragging, which makes editing certain attributes much, much faster than going in and trying to, let's see, type in a value, maybe 13, maybe 14. By left-clicking and dragging, we now have a much quicker way to find the correct value. Now, this is also useful for the transformation. You can see here, we can really come in and dial in exactly without having to muck around or have our cursor here in the middle. We can really just dial in exactly where we want this light. And of course, if we know the specifics, we can just type in that value and it will be applied into our world. Now, as you see, some of these are not able to be click-dragged. You'll notice the icon will change if that is selectable or if we can change that. Now, there's actually another way we can do this. But before that, let's take a look at how we can freeze or lock our inspector, because this, I have run into troubles before. This icon up here in the top right, you'll notice if we click on it, it's a very subtle change. But now, no matter what we select, our inspector is not going to update. So this can be useful if you need to change the value of something while selecting something else. Now, if you need to undo that or if you need to unlock it, just click this lock icon and you will jump to whatever you have selected. Now, one last thing I want to take a look at is debug mode, which is we don't really use it too much, but it's useful to see because it really exposes everything and it allows us to drag on everything. So to see this or to change this, we can right click on our inspector, or we can click on this little window or this little drop down here and change it from normal to debug. And this is going to change the name of the tab, and it's also going to change the display. So now we can see the local position, scale, and rotation, and some hidden attributes or properties that we did not see before. And that's because usually these are hidden for a reason, but this actually shows us the whole picture in a very easy to read format. And we now have the ability to left click and drag on many more attributes that we couldn't before. Now, as you can see here, some of these might be a little touchy, so this may not be the best thing. However, this is available to us, and if you ever need to get out of debug mode, right click and go to normal. So now that we know how to move around, access, edit components, let's now jump in the next lesson and take a look at how we can use the standard assets to create a character controller very, very quickly.